All right, welcome back. Today, we're diving into a source that takes a really different look at the Quran. It's not about faith, at least not in this analysis. Instead, it treats the text like a functional blueprint, almost like a design document for building an entire society. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to break down that design.
And that really gets us to the core question this source wants us to ask. Forget theology for a second. What if we analyze this text as a kind of technology, a technology of power? It's a pretty unconventional way to look at it, for sure, so let's see where this kind of structural analysis actually takes us.
So, here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll get our heads around this core idea of the Quran as an operating system for society. Then, we'll dig into how its authority is built, the psychological tools it uses for control, the mechanics it has for expansion, and finally, why the source argues this whole system just fundamentally clashes with the modern world.
Okay, let's start with that big idea from our source, that the Quran isn't just presented as spiritual guidance, it's framed as a complete instruction manual for everything, like a divine constitution, delivered word for word.
Now the key here, the absolute foundation, is this claim of divine origin. By positioning itself as the direct, unfiltered speech of God, the text completely removes any human author from the equation. And boom, right there you've established a basis for absolute, unchallengeable authority. So, how does the system actually build on that foundation of absolute authority? Well, that brings us right to our next section, the architecture of authority. The source we're looking at identifies a few really key pillars that are used to build this framework of control.
First up is this concept, the seal of the prophets. The source argues this is a critical piece of the architecture. Why? Because by declaring Muhammad as the final messenger, the system is effectively closed. It's locked. There can be no future updates, no new revelations, and no legitimate internal reform. It basically locks in the rules of its time, forever.
Next, the source points to how the text creates this incredibly stark black and white worldview. You've got the believers, who are the protected in-group, and then you have the disbelievers, the antagonistic out-group. This analysis suggests that this sharp division just simplifies the entire world into a simple loyalty test and, it builds this incredibly powerful us versus them cohesion. And the final pillar is really summed up by this one phrase, which you see repeated over and over again. It merges the authority of God with the political authority of the leader, the messenger. And the implication here is huge. Disobeying a political order becomes a religious crime. It's seen as an act of disbelief against God himself.
So if that's the structure of authority, how does the system actually make sure people comply? Well, this gets us to our third section, the psychology of control, or as the source calls it, the system of carrots and sticks.
The source really zooms in on how visceral the stick is. It points to passages just like this one, and it notes that the descriptions of hell aren't just abstract ideas. They are intensely physical, graphic, and designed to be felt.
And the analysis gives this a pretty powerful name, shock doctrine. The argument is that this kind of imagery isn't really aimed at your rational brain. It's designed to bypass logic entirely and hit you right in the fear center, making the very act of questioning the system feel dangerous on a deep primal level.
Of course, on the flip side, you've got the carrot, the promise of paradise. The source here frames this as way more than just a spiritual reward. It's a tangible recruitment and motivation tool. I mean, for people living in a harsh world of scarcity, this incredibly detailed promise of sensory delights, it was a powerful, powerful offer that could motivate immense sacrifice and loyalty. And that leads us perfectly into our next section, the blueprint for expansion. Because according to this analysis, the system isn't just designed to survive, it is absolutely designed to grow. So let's look at the strategic tools built into it. The source breaks this down into what it calls the 3 stages of warfare. See, when the community was small and weak back in Mecca, the commands were all about patience. Then, in early Medina, as they got stronger, they were given permission for defensive war. And finally, when they became a real regional power in late Medina, the commands shifted again, this time to offensive war, to establish dominance. The strategy literally evolved with their military strength. But wait, how do you deal with these commands that seem to change and even contradict each other? Well, the system has a tool for that. It's a legal principle called nask, or abrogation, and the source has a great analogy for it. It's like a software update mechanism, where later verses can literally overwrite earlier ones. And here's a crystal clear example of how it's supposed to work.
The source contrasts this earlier Meccan verse about tolerance with a later Medinan verse commanding war. So, according to the principle of abrogation, that later verse, the new code, is considered to have canceled out the old one.
So what's the end result? Well, the crucial takeaway, according to the source's reading of classical Islamic law, is that this software update isn't random. It has a clear direction. The later, more aggressive verses from Medina are held to abrogate more than 100 of the earlier, more peaceful verses from Mecca.
And all of this brings us to our final section, the clash with the modern world. This is where the analysis really explores the deep structural friction between the 7th century operating system and the way we think and live today.
Here the source makes a really provocative comparison. It argues that a better way to understand this system isn't by comparing it to another religion, but to a totalizing political ideology like Marxism. And as you can see, it points to these structural parallels: a global goal, a designated enemy, a system of total law, and a very severe penalty for anyone who tries to leave.
And that penalty has a specific name: ridda, or apostasy. The source frames this as the system's exit cost. It's a critical point, because faith and citizenship are completely fused. Leaving the religion isn't seen as just a personal choice. It's viewed as an act of political treason.
The legal ruling for apostasy, which comes from the prophetic traditions that form the basis of Islamic law, is, well, it's stark. The source calls this coercive retention. It's a mechanism to keep the community together by making the cost of leaving incredibly terminally high.
Okay, so let's put it all together. This functional analysis basically concludes that the Quran operates as a highly effective, self-contained technology of power. It sets up absolute authority, creates a unified in-group, uses incredibly powerful psychological motivators, contains a legal toolkit for expansion, and has these built-in firewalls to protect itself from any challenges, inside or out. And that leaves us right here with the final big question posed by this whole analysis. If we accept this framing, that this is a 7th century operating system designed for unity, control, and expansion, what happens when its core functions try to run on the hardware of the modern world? A world whose own operating system is built on totally different code, like individualism, human rights, and secularism. It's a really powerful question to think about.